one simple question and I want the answer. In the last so many years that the BJP has been in power, has your life become better or not?
ನಾನು
Answer me loudly. Yes or no? I can't hear. No. Your life has not become better. Have prices gone down? Have you got jobs? Has anything in your life become more positive and happy? It has not. No? So it's a very simple question. It's not so complicated.
ನಾನು ನಿಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯನ್ನ ಕೇಳಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ನಾನು ವೈಯಕ್ತಿಕವಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಬಿಜೆಪಿಯನ್ನ ದ್ವೇಷಿಸುವುದಿಲ್ಲ, ನಾನು ಯಾವುದೇ ಪಕ್ಷವನ್ನ ದ್ವೇಷಿಸುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಕಳೆದ 7-8 ವರ್ಷದಿಂದ ನೀವೆಲ್ಲ ಖುಷಿಯಾಗಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ನಿಮ್ಮ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಕೆಲಸ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆಯಾ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕೆಲಸ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆಯಾ? ನೀವ್ಯಾರಾದ್ರೂ ಖುಷಿಯಿಂದ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ? ನಿಮಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮ ಮಾಡಿದಾರಾ?
The elections are coming in a few months. I ask you only one thing. Look at the last few years. Evaluate your own life. Think about whether it has become better, whether you have got the facilities you required, whether the people in power have cared about your problems, or has your life become more difficult?
ಇನ್ನು 3 ತಿಂಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಚುನಾವಣೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ನೀವು ವಿಚಾರ ಮಾಡಿ, ಕಳೆದ 5-6 ವರ್ಷದಿಂದ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ಆಗಿದೆಯಾ? ಏನು ಬಿಜೆಪಿ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆ, ಕೊಟ್ಟಂತ ಭಾಷೆಯನ್ನ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಉಳಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ನಿಮಗೇನಾದ್ರೂ ಬದಲಾವಣೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನದಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಿದೆಯಾ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
I am told that the situation in Karnataka is very shameful.
ನಾನು ಕೇಳ್ಪಟ್ಟೆ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿಚುವೇಶನ್ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ನಾಚಿಕೆ ಪಡುವಂತ ಒಂದು
I am told that your ministers are taking 40% commission on jobs.
ನಾನು ಕೇಳ್ಪಟ್ಟೆ, ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳು 40% ಲಂಚವನ್ನು ಹೊಡಿತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ಕೇಳಿದೆ.
That 1.5 lakh crore rupees of your money, your earnings have been looted. 1.5 ಲಕ್ಷ ಕೋಟಿ
ದುಡ್ಡು, ನೀವು ಗಳಿಸುವಂತ ದುಡ್ಡು ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮ ಜೇಬಿಗೆ ಹಾಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
Only through corruption.
ಬರೀ ಲಂಚದಿಂದ ಅವರು ತಮ್ಮ ದುಡ್ಡನ್ನ ತಮ್ಮ ಜೇಬಿಗೆ ಇಳಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
Think about if some development work is to take place in Bengaluru for 8,000 crores and 3,200 crores of that is going into commission.
ವಿಚಾರ ಮಾಡಿ, ಬರೀ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರು ಮಹಾನಗರದಲ್ಲಿ 8,000 ಕೋಟಿ ಬಜೆಟ್ ಇದೆ. 8,000 ಕೋಟಿಯ ಕೆಲಸ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ 3,200 ಕೋಟಿಯನ್ನ ತಮ್ಮ ಜೇಬಿಗೆ ಇಳಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾರೆ.
There are shameful scams like the PSI scam.
ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ನಾಚಿಕೆ ಪಡುವಂತ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಸ್ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ಗಳಿದಾವೆ, ಹಗರಣಗಳಿದಾವೆ. PSI ಹಗರಣ ತಮ್ಮ ಕಣ್ಣು ಮುಂದೆ ಇದೆ.
Where police posts are being sold.
ಪೊಲೀಸ್ ಪೋಸ್ಟ್ ಅನ್ನ ಮಾರ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ.
You educate your children, your young girls and boys to get them jobs. Is this what you expect from the people who are in power?
ನೀವು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಮಕ್ಕಳನ್ನ ಬೆಳೆಸ್ತೀರಾ, ಶಿಕ್ಷಣ ಕೊಡ್ತೀರಾ, ಮಗಳಾಗಿ ಮಗನಾಗಿ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಶಿಕ್ಷಣವನ್ನ ಕೊಡ್ತೀರಾ. ಯಾವುದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ, ಯಾವ ಪುರುಷಾರ್ಥಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ? ಈ ರೀತಿ ಹಗರಣಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡೋದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರನಾ?
You have to pay bribes for bowels, driving licenses, housing, transfer, everything.
ನೀವು ಲಂಚವನ್ನ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಸೆಕ್ಟರ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಕೊಡಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಒಂದು ಡ್ರೈವಿಂಗ್ ಲೈಸೆನ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ತೆಗಿಸಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಲಂಚ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು. ಒಂದು ರೇಷನ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಅನ್ನ ತಗೊಳ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ಲಂಚವನ್ನ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಗವರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಲಂಚಾವತಾರ ತಾಂಡವಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
I am told that many of my sisters in Bengaluru who work in the garment industry went through a very difficult time during COVID. But none of you got any assistance from the government. The government did nothing to help you through these difficult times.
ನಾನು ಕೇಳ್ಪಟ್ಟೆ, ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ನನ್ನ ಅಕ್ಕ ತಂಗಿಯರು ಇವತ್ತು ಗಾರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ. ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಗವರ್ಮೆಂಟ್, ಈ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ತಮ್ಮ ಸಹಾಯಕ್ಕೆ ಬರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ತಾವು ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟದಿಂದ ತಮ್ಮ ಜೀವನವನ್ನ ಸಾಗಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ.
And it's not just the sisters who are working in Bengaluru or the roads of Bengaluru which are full of potholes. but it's farmers who are committing suicide because they cannot face the next day. 2.5 lakh posts of government jobs are lying vacant. They have not been filled. Crimes against women are sky high. I believe I have been told that it is 40 such crimes take place in a single day.
ಇದು ಬರೀ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಲ್ಲ, ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನ ಸುತ್ತಮುತ್ತಲಿರುವಂತ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರ ಭಾವನೆ ಇದು. ಅದರಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ 2.5 ಲಕ್ಷ ಸರ್ಕಾರಿ ನೌಕರಿಗಳನ್ನ ಈ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇನ್ನು ತುಂಬಿಕೊಂಡಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ರೈತರು ಆತ್ಮಹತ್ಯೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
You know how much you have to get a gas cylinder for today and how much you used to get it for 5 years ago.
ಮನಮೋಹನ್ ಸಿಂಗ್ ಅವರ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇದ್ದಾಗ, ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೇಂದ್ರದಲ್ಲಿ ಯುಪಿಎ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಇದ್ದಾಗ ಒಂದು ಸಿಲಿಂಡರ್ ಬೆಲೆ ಎಷ್ಟಿತ್ತು, ಈಗ ಒಂದು ಸಿಲಿಂಡರ್ ನ ಬೆಲೆ ಎಷ್ಟಾಗಿದೆ ಅಂತ ತಮಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಿದೆ.
Life has become unaffordable.
ಜೀವನ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ತುಟ್ಟಿಯಾಗಿದೆ. ಜೀವನ ನಡೆಸೋದು ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗಿದೆ.
Whether it is fees, marriage ceremonies, competitive exams, everything has become a burden.
ಯಾವುದೇ ಹಂತ ಇರಬಹುದು, ಯಾವುದೇ ಸೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಇರಬಹುದು, ಸ್ಕೂಲ್ ಫೀಸ್ ಆಗಿರಬಹುದು, ಕಾಲೇಜ್ ಫೀ ಆಗಿರಬಹುದು, ಮ್ಯಾರೇಜ್ ಸೆರೆಮನಿಗಳಾಗಿರಬಹುದು, ಏನೇ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಇವತ್ತು ಬೆಲೆ ಗಗನಕ್ಕೇರಿದೆ.
But nobody is holding the government accountable. Nobody is asking them about these things.
ಆದ್ರೆ ದುರ್ದೈವ, ಇವತ್ತಿನವರೆಗೂ ಗವರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅನ್ನ ಯಾರು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕೆ ಬೆಲೆ ಏರ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಯಾರು ಕೂಡ ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ.
So they are busy creating distractions, busy changing syllabus in textbooks, changing the teachings of Bhagwan Basavana in the textbooks, creating controversies rather than creating jobs.
ಬಂಧುಗಳೇ, ಆ ಬೆಲೆ ಏರಿಕೆ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ತಾವೇನು ಕೇಳಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಮನಸ್ಸನ್ನ ವಿಚಲಿತಗೊಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ಓದಿನ ಒಂದು ಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಬುಕ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಏನೋ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಗಳನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿ ನಮ್ಮ ದಿಕ್ಕನ್ನ ಚೇಂಜ್ ಮಾಡುವಂತ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನ ಬಿಜೆಪಿ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
The entire policy functions to benefit a few business people.
ಬಿಜೆಪಿಯ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಸಿದ್ಧಾಂತ ಬರೀ ಕೆಲವು ಬಂಡವಾಳಶಾಹಿಗಳಿಗೆ ಒಳ್ಳೆದಾಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡುವಂತದ್ದು.
These few people become richer and richer and the rest of the country is becoming poorer and poorer.
ಏನು ಬಂಡವಾಳಶಾಹಿಗಳನ್ನ ಬಿಜೆಪಿ ಅವರು ಬೆಳೆಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಅವರು ದಿನದಿಂದ ದಿನಕ್ಕೆ ಶ್ರೀಮಂತರು ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ನನ್ನ ಭಾರತ ದೇಶ ಮಾತ್ರ ಬಡತನದಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಳುಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
All the sources for jobs have practically shut down. The PSUs have been sold to the Prime Minister's rich friends.
ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಖಾಸಗೀಕರಣ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಜಾಬ್ಗಳು ಇವತ್ತು ಮಾರಾಟಕ್ಕಿದೆ. ಎಲ್ಲ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಖಾಸಗೀಕರಣವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಭಾರತ ದೇಶದ ಆಸ್ತಿಯನ್ನ ಮಾರ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ.
Instead of giving incentives to agriculture where jobs can be produced, agriculture is suffering, farmers are suffering.
ರೈತರಿಗೆ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಸಬ್ಸಿಡಿಯನ್ನ ಕೊಡುವಂತ ಕೆಲಸ ಆಗಬೇಕು.
And you know better than I do that small businesses and medium-sized businesses have suffered tremendously due to GST, demonetization and many of the policies of the government. Those are other sources of jobs.
ನಮ್ಮ ಭಾರತ ದೇಶದ ಶಿಲ್ಪದಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಮಾಲ್ ಸ್ಕೇಲ್ ಇಂಡಸ್ಟ್ರಿಗಳು ಕೂಡ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯನ್ನ ಹೊರ್ತವೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಜಿಎಸ್ಟಿ ಆಗಿರಬಹುದು, ಡಿಮಾನಿಟೈಸೇಷನ್ ಆಗಿರಬಹುದು, ಅವೈಜ್ಞಾನಿಕ ಇವರ ಒಂದು ಕೆಲಸಕ್ಕೆ ಅವೆಲ್ಲ ಇವತ್ತು ಕೂಡ ಶೀತಲಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾವೆ, ಕುಂಠಿತಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾವೆ. ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ತೊಂದರೆಯಲ್ಲಿದ್ದಾರೆ.
And if you compare this to Congress governments, you see that the Congress brought in land reforms. It had leaders like Sri Devraj or
ಬಂಧುಗಳೇ, ನಾನೊಂದು ಮಾತನ್ನ ನೆನಪಿಸ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳು, ಅದರಲ್ಲೂ ಡಿ ದೇವರಾಜ ಅರಸ್ ಅವರು ಇದ್ದಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಉಳುವವನೇ ಹೊಲದ ಒಡೆಯ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನ ತಗೊಂಡು ಬಂದ್ವಿ.
It waived off loans for farmers. 8,000 crores of loans were waived off. The IT hub was built by the Congress party along with all your efforts and hard work because the Congress party respected your hard work.
ಬಂಧುಗಳೇ, ಸಿದ್ದರಾಮಯ್ಯ ಸರ್ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿ ಆದಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು 8,000 ಕೋಟಿಯ 50,000 ತಲಾ ರೈತರ ಸಾಲವನ್ನ ಮನ್ನಾ ಮಾಡಿ ರೈತರಿಗೆ ಚೇತನವನ್ನ ತುಂಬುವಂತ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು.
You had schemes like Anna Bhagya, where 7 kilos of food grain and 1 kg of tuar dal was given to 3.8 crore beneficiaries.
3,08,00,000 ಜನರಿಗೆ ಅನ್ನ ಭಾಗ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಕ್ಕಿ ಇರಬಹುದು, ಗೋಧಿ ಇರಬಹುದು, ಬೇಳೆ ಇರಬಹುದು, ಸುಮಾರು 3,08,00,000 ಕುಟುಂಬಗಳಿಗೆ ಅನ್ನ ಭಾಗ್ಯದ ಯೋಜನೆಯನ್ನ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ತಗೊಂಡ್ಕೊಂಡು
You had Indira canteens, Kshira Bhagya, Matrupurna schemes through which all of you benefited.
ಇಂದಿರಾ ಕ್ಯಾಂಟೀನ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಜನಪ್ರಿಯ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬಂತು. ಬರೀ ಶ್ರೀಮಂತರ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಹಾಲು ಕುಡಿಯೋದಲ್ಲ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಮಾಜದ ಬಡವರು ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಕೂಡ ಹಾಲು ಕುಡಿಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಕ್ಷೀರ ಭಾಗ್ಯವನ್ನ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬಂತು. ಜೊತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬಸರು ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಮಾತೃಪೂರ್ಣ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳ ಒಂದು ಸಶಕ್ತೀಕರಣಕ್ಕೆ ಪೌಷ್ಟಿಕ ಆಹಾರ ಸಿಗ್ಲಿ ಅನ್ನೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾತೃಪೂರ್ಣ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ತಗೊಂಡ್ ಬಂತು.
And so many other schemes like self-help group schemes, even Anganwadi workers and helpers, their wages were increased. So many things were done by the Congress party.
ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ರಾಜ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರನ್ನ ಸಬಲೀಕರಣಗೊಳಿಸಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸ್ತ್ರೀ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮವನ್ನ ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡು ಬಂದಂತ ಒಂದು ಕೊಡುಗೆ ಯಾರ್ದಾದ್ರೂ ಇದ್ರೆ ಅದು ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಕೊಡುಗೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಅದರ ಜೊತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂಗನವಾಡಿ ಆಶಾ ಕಾರ್ಯಕರ್ತರ ವೇಜಸ್ ಅನ್ನ, ಅವರ ಪೇಮೆಂಟ್ ಅನ್ನ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಮಾಡುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಕೊಡುಗೆ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ್ದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ.
So today, my sisters, I am here to announce the Na Nayaki scheme. Na Nayaki meaning I am a leader. Say Na Nayaki. No, loudly, nicely. Na Nayaki. Na Nayaki. This is your chance to start changing your life, to start changing politics, to ask for women to be respected equally. And this scheme is specially for those women who are working hard day and night at home, supplementing everything, helping to build society, but are ignored by everybody. So in this scheme, each head of a family who is a woman will get 2,000 rupees per month. That means 24,000 rupees will be directly sent to your account in a year.
ನಾನು ಒಂದು ಘೋಷಣೆಯನ್ನ ಈಗಾಗಲೇ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ, ಮತ್ತೊಮ್ಮೆ ಈ ಘೋಷಣೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೀನಿ. ನಿಮ್ಮ ಭವಿಷ್ಯವನ್ನ, ಈ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ಭವಿಷ್ಯವನ್ನ ಕಟ್ಟುವಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ರಾಜಕೀಯ ಪಕ್ಷಗಳು ನಿಮ್ಮನ್ನ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಪ್ರಾಮುಖ್ಯತೆಯಿಂದ ನೋಡುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಸಮಯ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ನಾನಿವತ್ತು ಅನೌನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದಂತ ಗ್ಯಾರಂಟಿ ಸ್ಕೀಮ್ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಮನೆಯ ಯಜಮಾನತಿಗೆ ಸುಮಾರು 2,000 ಪ್ರತಿ ತಿಂಗಳು, ಅಂದರೆ ವರ್ಷಕ್ಕೆ 24,000ವನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಕುಟುಂಬಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪಕ್ಷದ ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಘೋಷಣೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡುತ್ತೆ.
This is called the Griha Lakshmi Yojana, and it is part of the bigger scheme of Na Nayaki. I told them when they invited me for this function, I told DKG, Surjewala ji, Siddaramaiah ji, I said I will come to announce this if you promise me that you will make a separate women's manifesto.
ನಾನು ನನ್ನನ್ನ ಆಹ್ವಾನ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದೆ, ನಾನು ಖಂಡಿತವಾಗ್ಲೂ ಈ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ, ನಾನಾಯಕಿ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ಗೃಹಲಕ್ಷ್ಮಿಯ ಒಂದು ಯೋಜನೆಯನ್ನ ಅನೌನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಖಂಡಿತವಾಗ್ಲೂ ಬರ್ತೀನಿ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು, ನೀವು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಬೇರೆ ಒಂದು ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋವನ್ನ ನೀವು ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಭರವಸೆಯನ್ನ ಕೊಟ್ರೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ನಾನು ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ಬರ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೆ.
Because there is not one thing that we want to do to make you strong. There are many things that we want to do to be able to make you stand up on your own feet and fight for yourselves. You know, we have also announced the 200 rupees, the 200 units free electricity recently.
ಬರೀ ಒಂದೇ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೆ ಇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಕುಟುಂಬವನ್ನ ನಿರ್ವಹಣೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಅನೇಕ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳಿರ್ತಾವೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಸ್ತ್ರೀಯರಿಗೋಸ್ಕರ ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಸ್ತ್ರೀ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಬೆಳಕನ್ನ ಚೆಲ್ಲಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಹಾಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಜೊತೆಯಲ್ಲಿ 200 ಯೂನಿಟ್ ಏನು ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಮನೆಗೆ ನಾವು ವಿದ್ಯುತ್ ಅನ್ನ ಫ್ರೀ ಆಗಿ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ.
So 200 units of free electricity will be provided to every house. And in addition, my colleagues will be announcing in their Women's Manifesto many new schemes for all of you to be able to move forward and to bring a change in your lives.
ಈಗಾಗಲೇ 200 ಯೂನಿಟ್ ನಿಮಗೆ ಫ್ರೀ ಆಗಿ ವಿದ್ಯುತ್ ಅನ್ನ ಕೊಡೋದ್ರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಗೃಹಲಕ್ಷ್ಮಿ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ನೂತನ ಯೋಜನೆ ಪ್ರತಿ ತಿಂಗಳು 2,000 ಪ್ರತಿ ಮನೆಯ ಯಜಮಾನಿತಿಗೆ ಕೊಡೋದ್ರ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಇನ್ನು ಭವಿಷ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಮುಂಬರುವಂತ ದಿನದಲ್ಲಿ ನಮ್ಮ ನಾಯಕರು ಅನೇಕ ಯೋಜನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಅನೌನ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡೋರಿದ್ದಾರೆ.
So do you believe in a strong Karnataka?
ನೀವು
Yes or no? Do you believe in a strong society? Are you going to build that strong Karnataka and that strong society? Are you going to lead the way? Are you going to be the leaders of your society, your homes, your villages and your state and your country? Just remember that it is in your hands to be that. It is in your hands to bring about change that transforms your society and your state. It is in your hands to ask for a politics that talks about your issues, your development, the things that matter in your life. It tells you about progress, development, education, jobs. Those are the questions you must ask. And I'm going to ask you to promise me that in this election, this is what you are going to ask every politician who comes in front of you. Promise me. Say, I promise that I will demand that my issues are heard.
ನಾನು ಶಕ್ತಿಯುತವಾದಂತ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶ್ವಾಸ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಶಕ್ತಿಯುತವಾದಂತ ಸಮಾಜದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಶ್ವಾಸ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಬ್ಬ ಮಹಿಳೆಯ ಅನಿಸಿಕೆಯನ್ನ ಗವರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಗಳು ಸರ್ಕಾರಗಳು ಕೇಳಬೇಕು. ನೀವು ಶಕ್ತಿಯುತವಾದಂತ ಕುಟುಂಬವನ್ನ ನಿರ್ವಹಣೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ತಯಾರಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ನೀವು ಶಕ್ತಿಯುತವಾದಂತ ಸಮಾಜವನ್ನ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ತಯಾರಿದ್ದೀರಾ?
When we first made a women's manifesto in Uttar Pradesh, many people laughed at us.
ಉತ್ತರ ಪ್ರದೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೆ ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಹಾಸ್ಯವನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು.
And even though nothing came out of it in terms of votes,
ಇಷ್ಟು ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ನಮಗೆ ವೋಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಆ ಮ್ಯಾನಿಫೆಸ್ಟೋ ಪರಿವರ್ತನೆ ಆಗಲಿಲ್ಲ.
we managed to make every political party notice women and respond to the needs of women.
ನಾವು ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಬ್ಬ ಮಹಿಳೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ರೆಸ್ಪಾಂಡ್ ಆಗುವ ರೀತಿ ನಾವು ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ ಇವತ್ತು.
Today, even the BJP has been forced to put ads in the newspaper showing what they do for women.
ಇವತ್ತು ಬಿಜೆಪಿ ಕೂಡ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರಿಗೆ ಏನೇನೋ ಆಸೆ ಆಮಿಷಗಳನ್ನ ತೋರಿಸುವಂತ ಕೆಲಸವನ್ನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
So by a small thing that we did, we managed to make political parties aware to the fact that they have to be answerable to women.
ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಮಹಿಳೆಯರು ಮಹಿಳಾ ಶಕ್ತಿಯನ್ನ ತೋರಿಸುವಂತ ಕಾಲ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಪಾರ್ಟಿ ಕೂಡ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಡೆ ನೋಡುವಂತೆ ತಿರುಗಿ ನೋಡುವಂತೆ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ.
So I urge you to make this election about you.
ನಾನು ತಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಳಕಳಿಯಂತ ವಿನಂತಿ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ, ಈ ಇಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಇಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಆಗಿ ನೀವು ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ.
And about your future.
ನಿಮ್ಮ ಭವಿಷ್ಯಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ಈ ಇಲೆಕ್ಷನ್ ನ ಮಾಡಿ ಚುನಾವಣೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ.
Jai Hind.
ಜೈ ಹಿಂದ್.
Thank you.
ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ಆಸೀನರಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ವಿನಂತಿ. ಇವಾಗ ಒಂದು ವಿಡಿಯೋ ಇದೆ, ನಾ ನಾಯಕಿ ಇದ್ದು, ಅದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ನಾಯಕಿ ಆಗಿರುವಂತಹ ಪ್ರಿಯಾಂಕಾ ಗಾಂಧಿ ವಾದ್ರಾ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಸನ್ಮಾನ ಇದೆ. ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ಆಸೀನರಾಗಿರ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಒಂದು ವಿನಂತಿ. ಸ್ಟೇಜ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇರುವಂತಹ ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಹೆಣ್ಣು ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಕೂಡ ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ಬಿ ಸೀಟೆಡ್. ಐ ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಎವ್ರಿಬಡಿ ಟು ಬಿ ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ಸೀಟೆಡ್. Please be seated. We have a short video that we will be playing right now about Na Nayaki program. And after that, there will be a... ನಾವು ಸನ್ಮಾನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ನಮ್ಮ ನಾಯಕಿ ಅವರಿಗೆ. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ 6 ಜನ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಕೂತ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ವೇದಿಕೆಯ ಮೇಲಿರುವಂತ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳನ್ನ ಆಸೀನರಾಗಿರೋದಕ್ಕೆ ಕೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಐ ಆಮ್ ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಯು ಆಲ್ ಟು ಬಿ ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ಬಿ ಸೀಟೆಡ್. ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಈ ಕಡೆ ಬಂದು ನಿಂತ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ಆಸೀನರಾಗಿರಿ.
ಅಳಲನ್ನು ಆಲಿಸು, ನೋವುಂಡ ಮುಖವನ್ನು ಅರಳಿಸು, ತಾಯಂತೆ ಮುಂದೆ ನಡೆಸು, ತಾಯಂತೆ ಮುಂದೆ ನಡೆಸು.
ಈಗ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಆಗಮಿಸಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂತಹ ಸರ್ವರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ, ಹಿರಿಯ ನಾಯಕರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ಬೆಂಬಲ ಕೊಟ್ಟಂತ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ವಂದನಾರ್ಪಣೆಯನ್ನ ಒಂದು ಸಾಲಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ವಂದನೆಗಳು. ಈಗ ಜನಗಣ ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರಗೀತೆ ಜನಗಣಮನ.
सभागृह सावधान, राष्ट्रगान शुरू करेंगे। जन गण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता, पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा, विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलसित रंग, तव शुभ नामे जागे, तव शुभ समागे, गाहे तव जय गाथा, जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता, जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे। आजाद हिंद जिंदाबाद, कौमी नारा वंदे मातरम। धन्यवाद।
Thank you very much, Hamid Fazal, for that wonderful and generous introduction. I must say that it's amazing to see this huge audience assembled in this Maidan here today. And I thank you all for coming, and even more for having to wait. I'm afraid it took me much longer to get here than we had planned, and my apologies to all of you who've had to stay long. I hope to make up for that in a certain amount of focused and concise brevity on the important issues before us today. So our dear President, my friend, Dr. P.A. Fazal Ghafoor, Dr. Hamid Fazal, Mr. O.C. Muhammad Salahuddin, Mr. K.K. Kunju Moideen, other distinguished figures on the dais, in the audience, and of course, my dear Sahodri Sahodaranmare, എല്ലാവർക്കും എൻ്റെ വിനീതമായ നമസ്കാരം. ആ വിനീതമായ നമസ്കാരം പറഞ്ഞ ശേഷം ഞാൻ വീണ്ടും ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് പറയാൻ പോവാണ് കേട്ടോ. Since Dr. Fazal Ghafoor himself spoke on these challenges in English, it would be easier. But you know, I was going to raise a number of different perspectives on the Constitution. But before that, I would like to pay a brief tribute to Dr. P.K. Abdul Ghafoor himself, whose 40th Charama Varshika we are looking at today. It's a sad occasion when you realize how much this great gentleman accomplished in such a short span of time. When you realize that he passed away of a heart attack while examining a patient, so on the job as a doctor, at the age of just 53. And for me, I had a special feeling about this because he was exactly 1 week younger than my own father. He was born the same month of the same year. And I lost my father at what I thought was too young an age at 63, 10 years later. So when I see that my friend Fazal had to suffer this very sad bereavement of losing your father at the age of 53, my heart goes out to him. But what a lot he packed into such a brief life. This is a man who has acquired distinguished medical qualifications, somebody who went and became first a member, then a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in England, a very prestigious medical qualification, somebody who taught as a professor at some of the most impressive medical colleges of our state, who then resigned his responsibilities in government service to take on the task of building up the MES from next to nothing to a point where the Muslim Education Society in Dr. Abdul Ghafoor's own lifetime became an immense nationwide organization with branches everywhere and a large umbrella covering 150 institutions, including no fewer than 35 colleges and I think 70 odd schools. It's an astonishing achievement. And to think that so much was done by such a young man makes us keep thinking, what more might he have accomplished had he been able to live the full life that so many of us look forward to these days at a time of medical advances. But I'm sure that Fazal feels that his father died as he lived in service of humanity, in working for people. He was literally examining a patient when he passed away. And today we must all bow our heads in respect for his memory. Let us remember Dr. Fazal Ghafoor for a brief moment of silence. I'm sorry, Dr. Abdul Ghafoor, I beg your pardon. But let us remember what the young Fazal Ghafoor would have had to go through in losing his father at that time. All right, let's turn to but you can see why Fazal Ghafoor was on my mind, because he said a few very interesting things in his own remarks and threw me a couple of interesting challenges. I had come with some other thoughts prepared, but I think the challenges he threw me are far more interesting. When you look at the two particular issues of the Indian Constitution that he raised, they're not the only ones, and I'm going to start by trying to situate the Constitution in a broader context, and then I will respond specifically to the two challenges that Dr. Fazal Ghafoor threw before us. The first one is, think of when the Constitution was written. It was written when the country was being torn apart by partition. The British were about to leave, their departure was imminent, but the flames of violence, of communal carnage were burning across the land. And at that time, the Constituent Assembly was sitting in what is soon going to stop being our parliament, and a new parliament is being built by this government. But in that Constituent Assembly, you had a large cross-section of Indian opinion debating what kind of country our India was going to be. And what to my mind was absolutely striking about this was that at one point there was a whole debate about whether the Constituent Assembly should even meet and discuss in the absence of the Muslim League members who were boycotting the Constituent Assembly in pursuance of their demand for a separate state of Pakistan. And a number of prominent Hindus, including Dr. Ambedkar, actually said we should not meet, we should not discuss, because we should all go along together. It was only when partition became a fait accompli, and it was very clear that Pakistan was going to be created after the government, the British Raj, announced that decision. Only then did the Constituent Assembly start its serious deliberations in 1946 on the future of the country. So that is the background under which this constitution was being prepared. And at that time, Jawaharlal Nehru spoke in the Constituent Assembly and said that he trembled with expectation as to what would be happening in the Constituent Assembly, because it was a moment of great transition for India, when India was going to go from the old to the new, a time when all sorts of changes were going to become possible. And what is striking at that time was that we had a very distinguished but somewhat elite assembly. These were people who had come through the elections of 1946, when the British had conducted elections with a very limited franchise. The population of India at that time was 300 million, but only 30 million were eligible to vote. There were a lot of property qualifications, educational qualifications. So the people who were not the kind of people who are there today in the parliament, who represent a much greater depth of Indian public and Indian public opinion. In those days, it was people from a certain stratum of society, a lot of lawyers, a lot of grand and important people. But because they were inspired by the freedom movement, they were caught up in a discussion that was infused with principles and a great vision to build a country through this constitution that would serve such a large mass of humanity for a long time to come. Now, one of the key issues that had to be discussed was indeed, as Dr. Fazal Ghafoor says, the question of secularism. And that was fundamental to the founding of the Republic, because the country had been divided in the name of religion. Let's recall that India was indeed partitioned, not as some other countries in the next few years would be partitioned. In the 1950s, you saw the creation of East and West Germany, North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam. And it was always either geography or ideology, or a combination of geography and ideology. That was not the case in India. It was not geography. It wasn't that North India went one way and South India went another. It was not ideology. It wasn't as if Marxists went one way and capitalists went another, or communists went one way and capitalists went another. No. The issue on which the country was partitioned was just one issue, and that issue was the question of, will religion be the determinant of our nationhood? Those who believed that their religion determined their identity, they wanted to create Pakistan in the name of their religion, and as a result, they divided the country. But those who remained explicitly rejected the argument, the so-called two-nation theory, on the basis of which India was divided. In fact, you would be not surprised to know that some people did raise the issue in the Constituent Assembly. They said, now that Pakistan has been created as a Muslim state, should we not make India into a Hindu state? And there was a lively discussion on this in the Constituent Assembly, but overwhelmingly, over 90% of the Assembly said no. Ours must be a country for all. Our freedom struggle was for all, and the country we build through this Constitution must be for all. So the basic message is, whatever your religion, your caste, your color, your language, whatever the region of the country where you were born, once you were a citizen of India under this Constitution, you were equal, you had the same rights as everyone else, and that was a very important principle that had to be affirmed. Today there is an unnecessary political controversy stirred up by those who are in power in our country around the fact that the word secular was not in the Constitution when it was approved in 1950. It was added 26 years later by the 42nd Amendment passed during the emergency of Indira Gandhi, when she added the words both secular and socialist to the Constitution. And so people are saying, why don't we take those words out, because our Constitution was not meant to be secular. I would say respectfully, they are wrong. They are wrong because even without the word secular, it was a secular constitution. A constitution that grants every citizen the freedom of worship, that grants every citizen the freedom of religion, the freedom to propagate one's religion, and the freedom of opinion to agree or dissent from anything, including religion. That is by definition a secular constitution. So if our dear friends who are in power today remove the word secular, I can assure you the Indian Constitution cannot cease to be secular. And then on top of that, there is one more concept that upholds our secularism, and that is the doctrine propounded by the Supreme Court justices way back in the 1970s in the Keshavananda Bharati case, the doctrine of the basic structure of the Constitution. They said you can amend anything you like, but you cannot alter the basic structure of the Constitution. Which means you cannot change India from a democracy by amendment, you cannot change India from a secular country by amendment, you cannot change India from a federal country by amendment, because that would be a violation of the basic structure. So this has put us in a situation where, though Dr. Fazal Ghafoor's concerns are justified, and I'll explain why in a minute, the constitutional position is that there is nothing to fear. But you know, it's very interesting that Dr. Ambedkar, who was chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution, famously said that a constitution is only as good as the people who run it, and that a good constitution can be really wrecked and messed up by bad people, and a bad constitution can be made good by good people. And that is a fact that, as he pointed out in the Constituent Assembly, is inescapable. What we are seeing today is not an erosion of secularism by constitutional amendment, but rather an erosion of secularism by politics. And that is something where I would have to say I appreciate the concerns expressed by Fazal Ghafoor. What is the issue here? The issue here is that just as this government has learned that it should not proclaim an emergency because the emergency was deeply unpopular and resulted in an electoral defeat for the government that had declared an emergency, but that you can achieve the same results without declaring an emergency. So you can actually intimidate the press, you can stifle dissenting voices, you can invoke sedition laws, you can actually put people behind bars, you can demolish homes and shops by bulldozers, and no one can stop you doing any of those things. And you can change and tighten the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Protection Act, in such a way that you can declare anybody a terrorist, and what is more, you then don't have to bring him to trial and he cannot get bail. that you can do all this without amending the Constitution, then why bother to amend the Constitution? That, I think, is where Fazal Ghafoor's concerns must be paid attention to. So all of these things are happening in our country. That is a result of politics. But whereas the Constitution is not easy to amend in the terms of its basic structure, in politics there is always an answer. And the answer is at the ballot box. The answer is your vote. Political change is the answer for a political doctrine that you do not agree with. Now, the second challenge that Fazal Ghafoor mentioned was the question of our federalism. Are we a federal state? And this is a very vexed question because, as he mentioned from his friend, the law minister in Tamil Nadu, the Tamils in particular have a very strong view that India is a union of states and that as a result, the union government, the federal government, should have no special powers to override the states. The problem, unfortunately, is that those who wrote the Constitution did not write a fully federal Constitution. They wrote a Constitution that has been described by foreign constitutional experts as quasi-federal, that is partly federal. In what respects is it federal? Well, we have states, we call ourselves a union of states. The states were reorganized 6 years after the Constitution was adopted on linguistic lines. But let me show you a few ways in which we are not the same as the United States that Fazal mentioned when he talked about a common civil code. Because in the United States, it is genuinely a union of states where each state has an existence of its own and came together to create the union. In India, the union came first and created the states. So the states in our present borders in 1956 were created by the union government. When you look at the fact that the national parliament, not the constituent assembly, was able to create states then and has created more states since. In 2000, as you know, Jharkhand was carved out of Bihar, Chhattisgarh was carved out of Madhya Pradesh by the union parliament. So you cannot therefore claim, as the Americans can, that the states together have created the union. The other problem is that the Constitution provides for the central government to oversee the states in significant ways. The institution of the governor is a very curious idea. Fazal Ghafoor has mentioned that in the context of the troubles that the Tamil Nadu is having with its governor. There are challenges for our present Kerala government, disagreements with the governor here. There were previously serious quarrels between the governor of West Bengal and the government of Mamata Banerjee. So you're seeing there have been a number of, and more recently in Maharashtra, between the governor of Maharashtra, Bhagat Singh Koshyari, and the then opposition-led government of the MVA, that is the Shiv Sena, the NCP and the Congress. And there were quarrels and clashes all the time. Because the governor is appointed by the central or union government without necessarily having to consult the state government or seek its opinion or its approval. And therefore, the governor comes with an authority that is derived entirely from the national capital and the national government, not from the states. And the governor still has to perform all the ceremonial functions, including appointing or dismissing the chief minister, calling or proroguing the legislative assembly. All of these things are done by the governor appointed by Delhi. And so you're seeing a situation where we have preserved a very curious fiction that the governor is the head of the state, just as the president is the head of our nation. Whereas we all know that at the national level, the real power is exercised by the Prime Minister. And when the President speaks to Parliament, he can only read out a speech written for him by the Prime Minister's government and approved by the government. When the Governor today was asked to read, not today, 2 days ago, was asked to read a speech in the Tamil Nadu Assembly, in the Tamil Nadu Assembly to actually lay out the program of the government. He did not like some of the language in that speech and he refused to read it. And instead he said something else which was not in the text. Whereupon the government passed a resolution saying that the only authentic version of the speech was a speech approved by the government of Tamil Nadu, and the governor walked out. Now here is a classic case where the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, the letter of the Constitution and the spirit of the Constitution, go in two different directions. The spirit of the Constitution respects a certain level of parliamentary convention, where, as I said, the governor is expected to follow the line of the government. But when the governor chooses not to, on the letter of the Constitution, he has the right. It's supposed to be the governor's speech, even though we all know it's supposed to be at the same time the government that writes the speech. This has raised some very serious constitutional questions that need to be addressed. In my view, it has also raised even the question of whether we need a governor at all. But that's where the whole debate between the power of the federal government and the power of the state government comes up. And I can tell you that I'm sure that no federal government would very likely be willing to end the existence of the governor. When you think about the formal roles of the governor, there is no role the governor is performing today that cannot be performed by somebody else, the Chief Justice of the court, for example. But if the Chief Justice of the State High Court were to swear in the Chief Minister, that establishes them as two separate branches of government, but would seem to put the judiciary on a slightly higher plane. Nonetheless, in the United States, that's what happened. The Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court swears in the President of America. So one could argue that there is no reason to have a governor being sent from Delhi who has the right to appoint the Chief Minister. Let the appointment come from the votes of the people, instruct the assembly elected after the vote to elect a Chief Minister and swear that person in with the Chief Justice. And that's one possible answer. And a lot of the ceremonial functions can be performed by all sorts of ministers and Chief Minister himself, rather than having a governor with all the privileges there. It's not an argument that I'm advancing as the only possible course of action, but I'm saying it's a legitimate question to ask whether we actually need a governor at all in any of the states. Now, that's on the question of federalism. There's much more to be said because we've had various ups and downs. You've had, for example, the question of the GST, which actually has in some ways diluted the taxation powers of the states, because it's a nationwide tax agreed by a nationwide council on which the state's finance ministers are represented, but where the overwhelming power lies with the central government. So federalism being gradually eroded is true, but the elements for that are in the Constitution. For example, Article 356 of the Constitution allows the government in Delhi to dismiss a state government. They can say, for example, law and order is not being maintained, and put the state government under president's rule. We've seen that a few years ago in Kashmir. In the old days, we saw it very often in many states, most famously and for the first time in Kerala in 1959, after the Vimochana Samaram, there was a decision made to dismiss the state government of Kerala. So when you look at all this, it is very clear that ours is a quasi-federal system and not a fully federal system, because the balance is tilted very strongly towards the central or union government. Now, there's a conversation we can have forever, but we don't have time. Let me move on. In addition to the two issues Fazal Ghafoor raised, I want to mention a couple of perspectives on the Constitution in addition to that before I wind up. The first point worth making is that one of the most significant developments in the Constitution was the expansion of Indian democracy. And that is, as I mentioned to you, only 10% of the population was actually eligible to vote in the 1946 election on the grounds of property and education. But our constitution very far-seeingly granted the right of universal franchise to every citizen of India above the age of 21 at that time, and subsequent to an amendment brought by Rajiv Gandhi, it's now above the age of 18. Whether you are educated or not, whether you own property or not, you have a stake in this country and you have the right to vote. That was an astonishing decision when you realize that the British left us with a literacy rate of just 16%. Our country was just 16% literate. Here in Kerala, we're used to 96%. Isn't it shocking to realize that just a few generations ago, 75 years ago in 1947, that we had just 16% literacy. And yet, our leaders said we have fought the freedom struggle in the name of all our people. Everyone must have a right to determine their future. That was an amazing thing. A second perspective is that not only was democracy deepened in that exercise, but there was a very important shift between the British idea of ruling India through communities to the Ambedkar and Nehruvian idea of ruling through of giving individual citizens agency and empowerment under the Constitution. What do I mean? For the British, communities had rights. So, for example, Muslims were part of an electorate where only Muslim voters were included and they could only vote for Muslim candidates. Christians, the same thing, and this was the sort of division, and the Hindus were in a sort of general electorate where they could vote. Now, why was this done? Because the British believed in divide and rule. But they also believed in all sorts of other things that created a sense of separate identity on the basis of religion. And why this was done was for imperial purposes, but it was also a way of keeping communities limited, because if every individual was a rights-bearing citizen, that individual could also start rising up more easily to defend his or her autonomy and agency as an individual and challenge imperial rule, whereas in a community, that person would be expected to stand up only for his community. Why did this happen? Because the British were horrified by what they saw in 1857, when Hindu and Muslim soldiers fought side by side under the banner of the Mughal monarch, Bahadur Shah Zafar, in order to overthrow the British Raj. And though the British quelled that so-called mutiny, which really was the first Indian revolt, though they quelled that revolt in a very brutal and bloody suppression that took more than a year and a half, nonetheless, they learned from that the lesson that if you allow Hindu-Muslim unity or unity of communities again, then our rule would be under threat. So what the Constituent Assembly did, Ambedkar and Nehru and all the others, was to say, no, we will insist that the individual has autonomy and agency. The individual citizen has rights. And those rights include the right to vote, but also the right to dissent from their communities. And that's also very important. So if you look at the way the Constitution has been framed, it was also an act of educating people in their own rights. People were to discover through the Constitution their right to acquire, if you like, their sense of their own political destiny and their own legal personality within our democracy. Now, the expansion of democracy that I spoke about also involved an expansion of rights. So what did you see, for example, as recently as the UPA government of 2004 to 14? You saw the creation of a rights-based framework, the Right to Information Act, the right to education, the right to employment, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the right even to food through the Food Security Act, and from the point of view of farmers, the right to land as well from the Land Acquisition Act. All of these things are means of enhancing and deepening a notion of rights inherent in the Constitution when they had reached a level of ripeness that they could further be expanded for all of us. And a final thought on the Constitution that I should leave for you is that it's also been amended 103 times, which may seem as if it's a weakness of the Constitution. After all, in the United States, they've been a democracy for much longer than us. Since 1789, they adopted their Constitution, and yet they have barely got 22 or 23 amendments. Whereas we in India have 103 amendments in just 75 years, and they've got 23 in 250 years. But the truth is, rather than it being an admission of weakness, I think we could argue it is a sign of the Constitution's inherent strength, because our founding fathers and mothers realized that a Constitution must be flexible enough to adapt to changing realities and changing times. And so, because India was going to go through changes that they could not foresee in the late 1940s, they did not make it too difficult to amend the Constitution when necessary, but as the Supreme Court will say, within the basic structure concept, to take things into a greater freedom. And the Supreme Court, in a series of judgments, has dramatically expanded women's rights, welfare provisions, and upheld the constitutionality of laws and amendments which have gone ahead and deepened the rights and hopes of some of our most disadvantaged and marginalized sections. There is, as I said, still the question of the spirit in which the Constitution is implemented. Our Constitution says that Parliament consists of the President and the MPs. Doesn't mention the Prime Minister there. But when the Bhumi Puja was to be done for the new Parliament building, it was the Prime Minister who conducted it, and there was no sign of the President. We are still a secular state, even by name, even though they haven't removed that name yet. But when the Ayodhya temple was to be built, the first puja was again conducted by our Prime Minister. These are all very clear signs of what the government would like to think of as the ruling party's wish to move India towards a Hindu Rashtra. That would certainly be a violation of the basic structure, which is why they have not tried to do it through an amendment. They have just tried to do it in practice. But this is where it becomes imperative for us to resist practices which essentially undermine the fundamental nature and spirit of the Constitution we have. The Constitution as an instrument for social change is what Dr. Ambedkar talked about when he said that we have a top dressing of democracy on the soil of a society that is fundamentally undemocratic. And he said, what did he say? He said that we have in the Constitution one person, one vote. But in our society, we don't have one person, one value. By which he meant, if you are from a Dalit community, you are not given the same value in society as somebody who, let's say, is a Brahmin. Or a rich person has a different value from that of a poor person. Today, the worry is that if you demonize an entire community on the basis of their religion, that you again change the constitutional value of one person, one value. To my mind, we must stand up for an idea of India where everyone is equal, an idea in which everyone has a value that is indistinguishable from the next citizens, where it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, if you're a Muslim or a Hindu, if you're a Keralite or a Bengali or from UP, none of these factors, if you speak Hindi or you speak Tamil, none of these things should make a difference, because the Constitution ensures that it cannot make a legal and constitutional difference, and that every citizen, and under all these labels, has the same rights in our society. That, to my mind, is the idea of India that is embedded in our Constitution. It is an idea that is well worth fighting for in our democratic politics, in our universities, in our classrooms, and in a society like ours here in Kerala, which has thrived on diversity, on pluralism, and on a consciousness that we as citizens of this proud country have rights rights that we can stand up for, that we can affirm, and rights that no one, no government can take away. Dr. Ambedkar actually said, let us remember that all majorities are temporary. He said this in a famous speech he delivered when the Constitution had finally been agreed in November 1949. He said, all majorities are temporary. Let not the majority think that theirs is a permanent majority. Every Indian citizen has rights, every minority has rights that cannot be taken away by the majority, because the majority is by definition temporary. That is a lesson we must remind some people of in Delhi. Let us remember that if we need to remind them, it's not only through speeches and forums and arguments that we can do that, we also have the power of the ballot box, and that's only a year and a bit away. Thank you very much for listening to me. I thank you all once again in memory of Dr. Abdul Ghafoor for having me here on this very special occasion. Nandi Namaskaram. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. We now move on.
Now we have a interaction session with the students and teachers. People who would like to discuss any subject with Dr. Tharoor. Any subject, because I think he knows most of the subjects under the sun, except probably except scientific subjects. So they are requested to come forward